Welcome, everyone. It's a nice crowd. You're in for a very, very good presentation this afternoon. My name is Ken Yalowitz. I'm the director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding, and I'm very, very happy to welcome you to the first of this year's Dickey Center Great Issues Lectures. This is now the 8th year that we've been holding this series of lectures. And I'm delighted, that we're able to continue to do so. This program of Great Issues Lectures commemorates President John Sloan Dickey's conviction embodied in the Great Issues course taught at the college during his presidency that an important part of a Dartmouth education is acquiring competence in civic engagement and responsibility. He was particularly concerned that these competencies include the understanding of complex global issues. And the subject of today's presentation by Richard Harris certainly qualifies. And equally important for President Dickey was something that we at the Dickey Center are very committed to. It's not only enlightenment, it's not only presenting important presentations on the major issues of the day, but also engendering in students and in the community more broadly a commitment to do something about those issues. Today's Great Issues presentation would not have been possible without the generous support of the Obenshain family, Bill and Penny Obenshain. Bill is here today. Bill is a class of 1962 and also 1963 Tuck. And please give Bill a warm round of applause. And I also just wanted to mention that this is part of some other series of things going on at Dartmouth as well. Some of you may be aware that there's something called the Dartmouth Centers Forum. At least I hope you're aware. But the Dartmouth Centers Forum is an organization made up of 12 different centers at Dartmouth, including the Dickey Center, the Rockefeller Center, the Ethics Center, the Tucker Foundation, and on and on and on. But in addition to our own individual programming, we also have a series of programs that we do jointly together, and we build that program around a common theme each year, and we do this all across the campus. And the theme for this year is Speak Out and Listen Up. And obviously the purpose of that is communication, how we're communicating with one another, how we speak out, and hopefully listen, which seems to be getting increasingly difficult these days. But nonetheless, today's lecture is also offered in support of that important theme. Now, I am not actually going to introduce today's speaker, although I'm delighted that he's here. I've already warned him that I just came back from a very interesting conference at Cambridge University in England, and one of the things that we were talking about is why there has been so much exaggeration about possibility of conflict and tensions up in the Arctic as a result of climate change. But I've asked Richard if he would, talk to that subject at some point. I'm going to be very interested. But another reason I'm very happy that Richard is here, I've been listening to his voice for years and years, and it's great to always see a person attached to the voice, so I'm really happy. But the pleasure of formally introducing Richard this evening belongs to Laura Levy. Laura is a second-year PhD student in earth sciences who is an IGERT fellow. And Laura, I believe, will explain what the IGERT program is. This is something we're very proud of at the Dickey Center. It's a program that's part of our Institute of Arctic Studies and one that we're very, very pleased with. So, Laura, let me introduce you, and please take the podium.
Hi, my name is Laura Levy. I'm a second-year PhD student in the Department of Earth Sciences and also a member of Dartmouth's Integrative Graduate Education and Research Trainee Program, or IGERT. And our theme is Polar Environmental Change, which is the National Science Foundation's flagship interdisciplinary program for PhD students. I want to welcome you to Richard Harris's talk today that is part of the seminar series co-sponsored by IGERT and the Dickey Center's Institute of Arctic Studies entitled Dialogues in Polar Science and Society. Our IGERT cohort of ecologists, engineers, and earth scientists has spent the past year focusing on science communication. How can we communicate our science effectively and clearly to both our peers and to the public? This past summer, while participating in the IGERT Field Seminar in Greenland, we spent time developing skills to communicate our science across our disciplines. We also had the unique opportunity to present our polar research to the public at the Katuak Cultural Center in Nuuk, Greenland's capital. We have sought communication advice and insight from members of Dartmouth's faculty, as well as many top visiting scientists such as Terry Chapman and Wally Broker. And we also wanted to gain another perspective, that from the media, and National Public Radio's science correspondent, Richard Harris, was a natural choice. Richard is known for taking complicated science stories and explaining them in straightforward terms without losing the complexity of the story itself. He has covered the United Nations climate negotiations and contributed to NPR's award-winning Climate Connection series. This summer, his reporting uncovered that the blown-out BP oil well in the Gulf of Mexico was spewing more oil than stated in the official estimates. His daily reports on the oil spill helped many of us stay abreast of the cleanup efforts. Among his many accomplishments, Richard has won the American Association for the Advancement of Science Journalism Award, is an honorary member of Sigma Xi, has shared the Peabody Award for Investigative Journalism on the tobacco industry, and this year the University of California at Santa Cruz is awarding him the Alumni Achievement Award. His presentation today is entitled Covering Climate Change in a Changing Media Climate. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Richard Harris.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. There are seats. It looks like if anyone is standing and wants to be sitting down, I can pause and let people take a seat. But let's see. I will try to keep this to a reasonable length of time so people can ask questions at the end. I am delighted to be here. I'm also class of 1963, but that was my nursery school. But I've been at NPR for. But I have been at NPR for 24 years, which sometimes feels like a full lifetime anyway. So anyhow, one thing I've been doing at NPR is, and even before coming to NPR, climate change has always been a fascination and interest of mine. I suppose I've been covering it for 30 years. For some of the earliest reporting I did was on climate change, and I've witnessed what I'll talk about today is witnessing sort of a change in how we think about climate change and how the media has changed in those years as well. And the first time I really remember doing stories about climate change were back at the American Geophysical Union meeting in San Francisco, a huge sort of Woodstock of earth sciences. If you've never been to this thing, they're vast, huge, fascinating meetings where everyone talks about everything. And it was early 1980s, and there was discussion about global warming, very matter of fact. It's like, well, gee, inevitably when we're dumping carbon dioxide and methane and other gases into the atmosphere, they're likely to trap heat. The planet's likely to warm up, and it was treated very matter of factly, but also completely, absolutely abstractly. It was just as though it's the same as the astrophysicists saying, well, in about 5 billion years, the sun is going to expand and turn into a red giant and swallow up the Earth, and that'll be the end of the planet. It's like, okay, that was sort of the same attitude the Earth scientists had about global warming. It's like, yep, it's going to happen. What else is happening? And it is transmogrified very much, obviously, the topic from something totally abstract to something very much more tangible for us. And dramatic in surprising ways. And let me start by telling a little story that I never would have guessed that I would be telling you back in the early 1980s when I started going into this. And this is a recent and ongoing story happening nearby Washington, D.C., where I am, the state of Virginia. The state attorney general, Ken Cuccinelli, has decided to go after a prominent climate scientist on basically charges of fraud. Basically, this is Michael Mann, who was at the University of Virginia early in his career and is now actually at Penn State. But he had, Michael Mann became infamous, I guess you'd say, for publishing some paleoclimate data that showed that it was so-called hockey stick graph that showed recent climate history the last 1,000 years or so, showing that basically the climate was fairly stable for most of this time, and then in the last brief period of time, global temperature increased along with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and this is shaped like a hockey stick, and it became infamous as the hockey stick graph and was embedded in some of the early UN reports and so on, and became much criticized because one problem, Michael Mann did have a problem with the handle of his stick, which was he didn't realize that it was covered with this huge fuzzy ball of cotton, which was actually the error bars, which he forgot to put on the handle of his hockey stick. And when you actually put the error bars on the handle of the hockey stick, it's not quite as dramatic a graph. And it caused a lot of fuss. It caused, actually, the National Academy of Sciences looked into it and decided, basically he was more or less right, but the statistics were, could have been sharper, would have been done differently if other people had done them. But basically, verifying that for the last 400 years at least, this is a very demonstrable trend of increasing temperature, global temperature. And if you go back 1,000 years, he could well be right, but basically there's enough uncertainty that they weren't totally sure. So this has been looked at in great depth among scientists, and but apparently that review did not satisfy the Attorney General of Virginia, who basically has decided to go after Mike Mann for fraud, basically scientific fraud, for using the wrong error bars and so on. And it's an amazing little tale of Cuccinelli is known as a climate skeptic, and he just decided, he's going to go after Mann because he just doesn't believe the results. And he says, actually, what he's doing right now is he's filed a suit asking for emails and correspondence that Mann has had with many of his colleagues. And his argument is that a paper that he wrote with a state of Virginia grant many, many years ago, basically, it had nothing to do with paleoclimate, actually. But basically, the argument, as I reconstructed, is basically that he used that paper to establish his reputation in order to get federal funds to then do the study that is disturbing to people like Mr. Cuccinelli. And basically he's arguing that it's a career based on this fraud of climate change, and he's going after these documents. The University of Virginia is fighting back very strongly against the Attorney General. I mean, the Attorney General is supposed to be protecting the university. It's actually going after the university, and the university has raised something like $350,000 of private funds to fend off the Attorney General and these sort of these obviously fairly politically motivated charges against Mike Mann. So, at any rate, from the AGU to that story now, there's a story about how we got there, and I'm going to spend some time talking about that story from my perspective, both from what's happened in the world of science and what's happened in the world of journalism. Because I should say, Mr. Cuccinelli did not get his data from the Washington Post or the New York Times or NPR that established Mike Mann's credibility or lack thereof. Came from a very different place and has very different motivation. I think it's part of the story of what's, not only is the climate changing, but the information climate of the planet is changing, and we're seeing both effects right now. So back in the day, I actually thought I knew what the arc of the story was going to be. With climate change, we're always trying to tell stories and trying to see how facts fit together into a nice storyline. And a nice storyline seemed to be emerging from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's reports. And I've covered all of them, I guess, that have come out. And I'll start with some key quotes from the reports in key years. In 1995, which was the IPCC's actually second report, their overall assessment of what was happening with the climate was that, quote, these results indicate that the observed global trend in mean temperature over the past 100 years is unlikely to be entirely natural in origin. The balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on global climate. So the scientists had stepped in 1995 and says, looks like more likely than not something's going on, and the human beings are playing a role in that. In 2001, the IPCC's third assessment revisited those results, and they came back with this quote: "There is new and stronger evidence that most of the warming observed over the last 50 years is attributable to human activities." So that's stronger language still. And then in their latest report came out in 2007, and the money lines from that are warming of the climate system is unequivocal, it says. They also say most of the observed increase in global average temperatures since the mid-20th century is very likely due to the observed increase in anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. So clearly I said, okay, the storyline is becoming clearer. The science, money is poured into science. A lot of effort has gone on. The models have been improved. A lot of things have happened. A lot of people have thought very seriously about it. The story's getting stronger and stronger and stronger as we move along. And, a nice and rational trajectory of information handled by science writers like myself in the mainstream media. It's like, well, we can say with increasing confidence that, this is really a serious concern, not solid, absolute certainty, but enough of a concern that we certainly need to be paying attention to it. And I thought, okay, that's it. After the 2007 report came out, I thought, okay, there are always a few skeptics bouncing around. That's healthy for democracy, healthy for science even. But I figured, okay, this is the transition. This is the flex point of the story. We've now established with as much certainty as we're likely to get what the science is on climate change. And now actually the hard part begins, because the science isn't all that difficult to contend with compared with the economics and the international policy related to climate change, because then what do you do about it? And that's a much, much, much harder problem. And I thought, okay, here we go. We're going to have, really big, tough discussions about the economics of it. I'm going to have to really understand and bone up on all economic policy to really get in and understand those arguments the way I got in and tried to understand all the scientific arguments, and plus all the international discussions, which I'd been following over the years. I figured it was all going to ramp up into that discussion, and they're valid, important, interesting issues. How do you, there are issues of global equity. There are issues of, how much of a trade-off is there between environment and economics? Does it really cost a lot of money? How are we going to deal with this? How do you share things around? I mean, there's just so many issues that I thought were interesting and important, and that could, frankly, keep people debating about this topic for while the planet warmed up. There's no shortage of things to do, but lo and behold, I was wrong. What happened was the debate went right back to, charges that the science was completely wrong. It took me a long time to understand, and I may not still fully understand why that happened, but why when the scientific community was so well established and had such clear, compelling thoughts about this, why did all of a sudden we shift back to that debate about, to put doubt on science? And indeed that's deep and growing deeper, that public doubt. There's actually increasing doubt that if you do public opinion polls, more and more people say they don't even think that there's a scientific consensus about climate change. And they even say that they think that more and more scientists are exaggerating climate change. And that's, partly, what is that based on? That's certainly not based on the reporting that's in most of the local newspapers. It's not based on what I put on in PR. It's not based on the New York Times. It's based on this whole new channel of information that's not science reporters sort of saying, look, I'm gonna sit back here and be your disinterested referee as best I can and weigh all of the science and let you know how it all comes out. It's a different world. It's the blogosphere, the internet, cable television, a lot of people whose primary motivation isn't just sort of to sift through the information and see what they can offer their best judgment, but have many other motivations behind it. And let me talk a little bit about how that has played out recently. I mentioned the Ken Cuccinelli thing, which I think is clearly a product of that kind of that channel of information that is basically from the blogosphere and elsewhere. But I think one of the most telling stories really was the so-called ClimateGate episode of this past winter, when somebody apparently broke into a computer at the University of East Anglia or someplace and stole a bunch of emails between the scientists there and many other prominent scientists around the world. And basically that was used as, the excerpts of that were used to argue that science was out of control, the scientists were out of control, that it was all a big lie, and it was sort of the big proof that this was a big, vast conspiracy of climate change. And I think I think that was immensely damaging to come out right before the Copenhagen meetings, and I think it played a dramatic role, even though most of us in the news media didn't sort of subscribe to the idea that this was, the proof that the scientists have been lying to us all along. I will say that it was disconcerting to me to read what I read, but and when I reported about it, what I did report about was the fact that what I did see was the story that emerged was not a very happy story about how scientists interact with one another. I said nothing in the emails undercut the basic tenets of the science, but there were some behaviors that came to light that were cause for concern, and in particular, the way the scientists felt they really needed to circle their wagons essentially and manage the peer review process. You could see in the email exchanges back and forth that they would gun hard at editors who were about to accept a paper that they thought was a bad paper, and their explanation was, under normal circumstances, peer review would be fine. Everything that goes in literature doesn't necessarily survive. I mean, it gets tested by other scientists, and if it's found wanting, it sort of falls off the radar screen and nobody particularly cares. But they felt peer review for them was an important point where they had to interfere with or to step into the process, because they felt that once paper got into the scientific literature, even if it was a bad paper, it would be picked up by the blogosphere, by politicians who are against climate change and so on, and would do damage to their cause. So that was indeed concerning and an important and legitimate story to report, as I did and as other people in the mainstream media. But so many other people took the story to be basically proof that that the science was all fraudulent, which is simply not supported by actually reading the emails as I read them. The other thing that came out were around the same time were the recognitions that there were errors in the IPCC fourth assessment report. That my favorite one, actually favorite in a cringing kind of way, was the statement in the report, not in the executive summary, but in one of the big volumes that was the backing volume, saying that by 2035, a huge amount of the water supply for Asia could be gone because the ice up in the Himalayas could melt away, and basically this could deprive something like 1 billion people of their water supply throughout East and Asia and China and so on. And it was just it was an amazingly stark number, and it turns out it was also completely wrong. The genesis of it is an interesting story, which is part of it came from a reporter from the New Scientist magazine who called up some Indian scientist who was up in the mountains and had a 10-minute phone conversation with him. And apparently he said on the phone, "Yeah, I think by 2035 these glaciers could be gone." Not exactly peer-reviewed science, but that ended up getting picked up by a report by a non-governmental organization, environmental group. They put it in a report, and and the IPCC, unfortunately, decided to cite that report as the basis of the statistic. Part of it was also confused by the fact that there actually had been some more serious study of water resources in the Himalayas, and one of those studies found that water resources could become an issue in the year 2350, not 2035, but 2350, and those numbers got scrambled as well. So it was a sad comedy of errors there, and everyone makes mistakes. This was not a cornerstone of the IPCC report, although Al Gore and Senator John Kerry did actually talk about these numbers and wring their hands about it on the Senate floor after the report came out. So this was not also just a trivial footnote, as it is sometimes referred to. These numbers did start to take on a life of their own. So, yeah, bad, yeah, to make a mistake like that, but does it completely undermine the credibility of the IPCC? Well, no. It's but little things like that have basically been fodder for the blogosphere and for cable TV, basically to say, guess what? It's all a hoax. It's all a liberal plot, and it's not really happening. So how does this happen? I mean, why does public opinion shift so readily under circumstances like this, where people, where the facts seem to be kind of thin, but they seem to attract a great deal of attention. And part of that comes down to just the state of public knowledge. Last week, Yale University put out am I allowed to mention other Ivy League colleges? Put out a study of public opinion looking at, what people really know and understand about global warming. And you could look at this in a couple of ways. I'll just give you the numbers, and you can decide whether they are good news or bad news. But basically, I will start. The good news is 87% of people had at least heard of global warming in a national poll. So only 13% of Americans hadn't. So of those that have heard of the greenhouse effect, however, I'm quoting from the summary, 66% correctly understood that it refers to gases in the atmosphere that trap heat. So 2/3 of people who've heard of it say it's gases in the atmosphere trapping heat. 21% thought it was something to do with the ozone layer, and another 10% say they didn't know. They'd heard of it, but they didn't know what it was. A majority, that 63% of Americans understood that global warming is happening, while 19% said it's not happening, and 19% say they didn't know. Half of Americans say that if global warming is happening, it is caused mostly by human activities, and over a third say that if it's happening, it's caused by natural changes, and 7% reject the question and say global warming is not happening. So in an environment where there is at least some public doubt or lack of knowledge, it's kind of easy to see how you can start to sow doubt and misinformation in a situation where people actually, many people don't have full grasp of the data. I have to tell this engineering joke, but it's the optimist says a glass is half full, the pessimist says it's half empty, and the engineer says the glass is too big. So, becoming the optimist here, I think that there is encouragement in these numbers, which is people. I mean, many Americans, most Americans do appreciate that global warming is. Know what the greenhouse effect is. Know that global warming is happening, even if they don't totally agree about the causes of it. So that's the glass half full. But what is happening is we're seeing public opinion in terms of their confidence in this information is sinking. I'll just cite you a couple more numbers, and I'll move along. From a Pew poll in 2006, 77% of Americans said that there's solid evidence of global warming. Now, the last time they did it, I guess in January, it went from 77% to 57% saying there's solid evidence of global warming. A lot of that actually is the people who say that basically it's not happening, and that went from 10% to 20%. So there's a strong core of people who want to doubt it and find opportunities to doubt it, and that's undoubtedly related to both the ClimateGate email scandal and the problems with the IPCC report, the technical errors, and I mentioned one. There were others that were picked out as well that said that IPCC was not perfect. So this gets back to the question that I raised earlier on, which was, so why are we talking about the science again instead of talking about all of these complicated and difficult issues about how you cope with the problem as opposed to whether there is a problem? And I think part of it goes back to, I've talked to some psychologists and social scientists, and they say part of it is that the easiest thing to do if you're confronted with something that's really big and hard and difficult is just to deny it. I mean, it's human nature. And so there's just an element of, let's just pretend this isn't happening. It's the simplest way of dealing with it. And the more people know, the more they realize how much is involved in doing something about it. For example, it is a really, really hard problem. If you shut down all of the emissions in the United States tomorrow, bing, just like that, if you could just turn off the emissions, basically you don't even start to solve the global problem, because we're responsible for less than 25% of global emissions. And basically you've got to get way below that before you stop building up carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it's a huge problem. And to sort of put in perspective how much looking forward the problem is a global problem, I'm going to quote you from the a report that came out recently by the Department of Energy's information agency, and it forecasts that worldwide energy consumption will increase by about 50% from 2007 to 2035. 50% increase in energy requirement. Most energy, of course, comes from fossil fuels and puts greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The total energy demand in non-OECD countries, which is countries like India and Asia in particular, India and China, increases by 84%, and compared with an increase of 14% in OECD countries. So most of the growth, most of the future emissions are going to come from India and China and other huge coal-burning countries, and that's so we have to, if we're trying to think about solutions to climate change, we need to, obviously set a good example and do what we can here, but we also have to recognize that the problem is much bigger and is international in scope, and we need to be thinking about how to deal with that. Plus, on top of that, there's something like 1.5 billion people in the world who don't even have electricity right now. And so that's part of this growth is to put light bulbs in people's bedrooms so they can read at night. And I was traveling in Africa a few years ago, and we got a little bit lost, and we were way out in the countryside in nighttime, and we were coming back, winding our way through these dark back roads, and we would go into entire villages that had no electricity. It was just dark, and people were out in the street having a good time, but I'm thinking, how are these kids reading books if they can't even turn on a light bulb at night? How are they listening to the radio? I mean, you need the radio, and maybe they had batteries for that. But it's just astonishing to think that how many people just lack those basic necessities. And if you're thinking about solving global warming, I think you also have to think, well, maybe first of all we need to think about raising the standard of living of people in the world who, obviously lack of electricity also means lack of health care and a lot of other things. I mean, there are a lot of problems in the world above and beyond global warming, and we shouldn't get so carried away with global warming that we forget all of these other issues that we need to deal with. So it's a huge problem. And how successful have we been in this country? Well, I think the best example is California, that has managed basically to stop growth of emissions on a per capita basis over the last several decades, which is a pretty good accomplishment, except that, of course, the population of California is growing. So, of course, their total emissions are growing, even though if their emissions per individual are not going up. So even our best domestic example is not a brilliant example. And as a matter of fact, you may be following the Proposition 23 in California, which seeks to repeal California's law that would call for a dramatic and rapid increase in the use of renewable energy in the state. So even in green and sunny California, there are issues about what do we do with climate change? Is it going to be this? This does get to the more the debate I expected, which is does this cause job loss? Does it create a huge strain on our economy to do these things, or is it good for green job growth, et cetera, et cetera? And that is playing out in California right now. Let me turn a little corner here and talk a little bit about the problems that are inherent in the story from the standpoint of a journalist. And I think I need to say up front that I always struggle with trying to convey the best of the science about it. There are honest, open questions about science, and it doesn't do anybody any favors to say, we've resolved all those issues. IPCC 2007 said, it's all solved, we don't even have to think about the science anymore. That's not true. There are still big questions that I grapple with, and at the same time, I want to let people know that there's some uncertainty, but not say the uncertainty is an excuse that you can just forget about it, because that's the wrong conclusion to draw. So, but we, just remind those of you who don't know that we don't actually have a really clear sense of how much temperature will rise for a given amount of carbon dioxide if it doubles or whatever. There's uncertainty about exactly how much that will happen. first principles tell you that if you put something in the atmosphere that traps heat, you're going to get more heat trapped. But there's all sorts of complicated feedbacks that make it really difficult to quantify that with great confidence. In fact, I was just reading an article by Kevin Trenberth, who is a scientist at National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, and he published a paper in Nature Reports Climate Change, a journal, recently that said basically, guess what, folks? As we improve our climate models and are able to incorporate more of the climate feedbacks, for example, what's happening with, the Arctic, with methane coming out of the permafrost and maybe carbon dioxide being soaked up in more places, actually, we're going to increase our uncertainty about how much carbon dioxide, how much warming we'll get for a given amount of carbon dioxide. So the paradox is better, more complete, comprehensive science is going to give us larger error bars about how big a problem it's going to be. I mean, that means there could be, on the positive side, glass half full, it means that maybe the worst case won't be as bad as we think. On the other side, the worst case could even be much worse than we've been thinking about. So, that's Kevin Trenberth is a very thoughtful scientist and thinking, how's the public going to deal with this? How are journalists going to deal with a question like this? Do we say, oh, there's so much more uncertainty about global warming, we don't have to worry about it, or undoubtedly there'll be advocates saying, oh, there could be 8 degrees warming by the end of the century, and there'll be other people saying, it could only be a degree, we can just forget about it. And those are, critical issues to convey, difficult to do without just leaving people thinking, well, gosh, it's so uncertain, I don't have to worry about it. So that's what I struggle with, and that's a reality of climate change. And to point to Katrina and say, see, climate change, or to point to Katrina and say, this is the kind of thing that happens as a result of climate change, doesn't necessarily serve the public. And I think it may even partly contribute to the fact that people are that more and more people think that scientists are exaggerating climate change, because we do hear things like that. And it's a complicated mix of propaganda and on both sides, actually, that lead people to be a little bit, to have their heads spinning a little bit about what's really going on. I mean, one thing that I think scientists are very confident about, and you don't hear skeptics arguing about because there's not much wiggle room, is the acidification of the ocean. Because as carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere, a lot of it soaks into the ocean, turns into carbonic acid, lowers the pH, raises the acidity of the ocean, and that's already measurable. That's already of considerable concern. The biological consequences are not entirely clear, but having more acid in the ocean is certainly not good for shell-building organisms, and I think that's sobering. You can argue back and forth about what climate feedbacks are going to mean for global temperature or rainfall patterns or the like, but you can sort of say, look, we already know the pH of the ocean has dropped by 1/10 of a point, could go another 1/2 a point. It's a logarithmic scale, so that's a lot of acid, and it's something that we really need to be. We can't just shrug our shoulders about and say, oh well, that's a really serious thing. Also, I think the data on ocean temperatures is quite strong. A lot of the heat, actually, most of the heat that gets trapped in the Earth's system actually ends up in the ocean, not heating the air. Water holds heat a lot better than air does, and so a lot of global warming is actually ocean warming, and that's been fairly well measured by many scientists internationally. Pretty long historical record of that as well. So it's those data are pretty solid as well, and they're not going away. So, but the problem is, as I say, there's a problem as a journalist of sort of having of the narrative. How do I tell the story? It's kind of a hard story to say. If I can't say, oh, Katrina was caused by global warming, explain the more subtle things that a lot of the models suggest that extreme events like that are more likely to happen, and that's a bad thing. But it's not. You can't point to a specific thing and say, global warming. On the flip side, it's actually pretty easy to get a great narrative storyline going on for something that's a scandal, a cover-up, a conspiracy, the secret cabal of climate scientists who are quietly hatching plots to skew the scientific literature and so on. And those storylines may not take off in the mainstream media, which I'm part of, but they certainly are easy and spread rapidly. They're really easy to tell. They're great stuff for blogs, and it doesn't take very much data to spin a conspiracy theory. It's a great thing about a conspiracy theory is you can really do it on a shoestring. So I think that's really there, and that's something to be coped with. I think I was talking to a student earlier today about what about Washington D.C.? It's like nothing ever changes unless it's a crisis. So don't we have to say global warming is a crisis in order to make Washington act? And I think I certainly understand that sentiment. I just don't think it works. And I think it works or doesn't work very often. It works when it doesn't really affect very many people. I think acid rain might be an example where it was a crisis that basically did lead to legislation, although it was never like a big public outcry. It was not a huge surge of public demand that, we have to do something about acid rain. It was a quieter thing. I think the ozone hole and ozone depletion was was a genuine crisis, but it was not but it wasn't really dealt with in any serious political way in Washington D.C. It's just, fortunately, it was a very easy fix. Get rid of these chlorofluorocarbons, which they did pretty rapidly, and that could be resolved with minimal fuss and bother. And in fact, it actually made money for the companies that then were making those and got to switch and make a whole new bunch of chemicals. So it wasn't really a hardship on anybody. I think the more provocative model for climate change, I was sort of thinking, well, how do we ever get out of this? And I've been listening a lot to people like Dan Sarowitz at Arizona State University, and Roger Pilkey Jr. and these other folks who are sort of trying to think, well, there must be a third way. There must be another way to get away from this political problem in Washington. And they talk about, they think, well, let's try to do something like what happened with agriculture at the beginning of the 20th century in this country. It went from being a sleepy and not very productive enterprise to one that basically new ideas were picked up and carried around by the Agriculture Extension Service that the federal government created, and agricultural productivity really took off in this country. You can talk about obviously there are negative effects of monocultures, et cetera. It was nothing is ever a panacea, but it really made food abundant and affordable in this country, to borrow a marketer's catchphrase on that. But it really did work, and it didn't involve people in pitchforks marching up to Washington D.C. saying we need more productive agriculture. It was just people recognizing that this is something that we need to do. And when you look at the current state of affairs politics in Washington with climate change, we just saw that the Senate gave up on doing anything too serious this year on climate change, and probably won't do anything once the weight of the House and the Senate shifts to a more conservative party. There was an editorial in today's New York Times that pointed out that of the 20 Republicans running for Senate, who are the 20 most likely to win, 19 of them are on the record saying they don't think climate change is caused by human activities. So this is, so I think it's fair to say that we're probably not going to see a lot of dramatic activity on that. I also think that that's not necessarily I'm not sure how much that's a deeply held intellectual point of view. I think it has more to do with the fact that it's a very strong part of the politics in Washington right now, which is basically just the politics of no. Everyone wants to say no to whatever anyone else wants to do. And I think I'm actually not as worried about that as maybe I should be, but I actually think that that's an attitude that is more a position as opposed to a belief. And maybe in time that position can change if we can make the circumstances change, or if you can find something that's not considered damaging or bad to business and so on, and dealing with some of these issues that, this so-called science debate is really a surrogate for all of these other debates about who wins and who loses, or who's afraid of winning and who's afraid of losing in the U.S. economy. I look at my own role and I say, well, where can I be? Where should I be as a journalist, a member of the mainstream media, when so much of the media is it's on the outs. I mean, the whole mainstream media, the business model is collapsing. The general attitude towards the media is getting more and more cynical, and people don't believe us very much about anything. It's not just climate change. It's much more fun to read the blogs that support your point of view and not challenge you than it is to read a newspaper article that may actually have information that you disagree with. So we get attacked from both sides, both from the people who think that we are, just shilling for climate change, and the other side who thinks that we're basically been lowballing this problem, and basically the Earth is in serious, severe crisis. And if there was ever an issue that we should be standing on the rooftops and shouting out about, it should be this one, and we're failing in our civic responsibility in that regard. So some people say, well, if you're getting it from both sides, it's a good thing. It's like, oh, I'm not sure that's true. It's not fun at any rate, but and often I think it's, people assume that it's all, that this is all because Exxon has funded a huge, disinformation campaign. I actually don't believe in that. It is true that Exxon has put money into some of the advocacy and lobbying organizations and so on. But I actually think that if you think it's all about the money, you're missing the forest for the trees. It's really a big ideological fight, and it's not. The money is in there, but it's a distraction more than anything else. I think I already mentioned, the role of cable TV and the blogosphere and so on as a way of, they basically get the raw information from us still, but then they do with it what they will, and they make much better stories than we can make out of the information for reasons I alluded to before. But it's hard to compete in that echo chamber. So anyhow. Are you all feeling a little low? I can end on a happier note here, which is, I think there is a way forward, and I think the first thing is to understand a bit more about what the actual debate is, and it is about ideology, it's about economics, it's about how much the government should be telling us about what we should be doing, what our behavior should be, and the economics. The reality is, as long as we use the atmosphere as a free sewer, it's gonna be hard to move away from that, and that's essentially what we're doing with carbon dioxide. It's also, we've discovered through countless times how easy it is to sow doubts. You could say anything, and 20% of the American public will believe it practically. The idea that the Obama healthcare had death panels was took a huge amount of. A lot of people believe that, and it was, there was no substance to it, but it's much easier to believe something dramatic like that. Just all you have to do is say it, and a certain percentage of people will believe it. You can all think of your own examples of, weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East and so on. There are plenty of other examples. And the psychology of denial, also I mentioned that. It's much easier if you're confronted with something really unpleasant and an insolvable problem just to say, well, it's not a problem. And I like to do that, but it's also not necessarily a permanent solution to the problem. The other thing is that important to remember is that the messenger also matters, and I must have to admit that maybe we need to think differently about who the messengers are. Maybe with journalists in sort of disrepute, maybe we shouldn't be the messengers as much as we are. Maybe people believe pastors, people believe farmers. People used to believe scientists. I think they still do to some extent. But I think even that, I'm afraid scientists are following journalists somewhat into the down the hall of being not wholly believed. So I think that we need to, as a society, as people who are thinking about how to convey these messages, need to think a little bit differently about maybe who the messengers are. So what do you do? Well, I think one thing that this entire episode has told us is that really, it doesn't, despite our own gut instincts, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to argue the science. It's a quagmire to go in there. It is so hard to win an argument. If you've ever watched a debate between a creationist and a scientist, the creationist almost always wins because scientists, the more you stick to the facts, the harder it is to win an argument like that. And it's so in some ways, at this point, there are people who argue we don't even need to argue the science anymore. The public actually knows enough, going back to the glass half full on the statistics. People know that things are happening. A lot of people believe it's human activity. And Roger Pielke Jr., who's just got a new book out about this whole topic that's quite provocative, says, points out in that book, among other things, debates are never won anyway. A public policy debate like this is never won anyway by just convincing everybody about one point of view. You have a certain percentage of people who believe it, and then you basically go around and you find an accommodation that doesn't require everyone to be on board and to believe a point of view. But you have to find decision makers who can do that. And how do you do that? Well, one way of approaching it is you don't make the policy driver about climate change. It's there. We all know it's there. But you don't have to say we have. If you try to confront that directly, you're going to run into this science debate kind of thing. So what we've started to see, the White House obviously has figured this out to some extent. They've been trying to push green jobs, for example. They've been pushing more efficiency, higher CAFE standards for automobiles, things that basically have other reasons for action. Compete with China. It's like China's taking over solar panel and wind turbine construction. How about we compete with China and not let them grab all that valuable commercial real estate or not real estate, but commercial activity that's coming up. Think about energy security in this country. If we had more domestic supplies of energy, then we'd be less dependent upon the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. So there are lots of arguments you can make that don't require the climate change argument, but you can quietly be thinking, plus it's good for climate change. And you don't have to say it out loud. You could just think it in your head. You can also appeal to values that people hold dear. It's interesting. Frank Luntz, who's a famous Republican pollster who crafted many messages that have been highly successful, was recently hired by Environmental Defense Fund and sort of more Democratic-leaning organizations to look at climate change and see how you could frame climate change to sell it to people. And he found that actually, if you frame it the right way, you can get action in Capitol Hill. He found the problem, which I alluded to earlier, is that basically deadlock is what counts right now in Capitol Hill. Nobody wants to do anything for any reason. So he says it's not the issue actually. It's this ideological deadlock that Republicans don't want to help the Democrats get anything done. The Democrats are stymied, don't necessarily want to move as far as the Republicans do on compromises and so on. So basically, it's the more general problem of Washington politics and not the specific problem of climate change. But studies like that show that people, there are some very deeply held American values you can appeal to, like people don't like to waste things. So if you want to, if you portray an efficiency program as just not being wasteful, you can get people on board with that. That's a deeply held American value. Or stewardship of the land is another value that Americans hold, and you can say let's cast it in those terms. So those are things that I think can move the debate forward. So where does that leave scientists? I know there's some scientists in the audience, and I guess the answer is the lesson is you got to keep doing what you're doing. I think it's unlikely that what you're going to do is going to provide sharper data that's going to once and for all resolve the uncertainties. I think as Kevin Trenberth suggested, you actually might, the more you know, you may actually make things look a little fuzzier, but that's not bad. It's the facts, So, and you got to keep providing us those facts. You can help us better anticipate what's going to happen in terms of when is the Arctic likely to start crumbling away? What can we do? Over what time scale do we have to worry? And I think maybe even this is almost this is hard to say, but I think it's maybe true that maybe worry a little bit less about getting your message to the public. I mean, it's my job to help get that message out, but I think that to some extent that's backfired a little bit as the message has become more shrill and more strident. I think that it's actually done some damage. I think people are understandably getting more and more alarmed and concerned, but I think that message is not producing the desired effect. And what can I do as a journalist? Well, I can sort of hold firm in my knowledge that at least some people still believe what they hear on the radio, or some people still believe what they read in the newspaper. And it's important, even if there's a lot of information out there that I don't think is particularly accurate, I think it's still important for me to get out what I believe is the truth, what scientists, the best scientists, to the best of my ability, and get that out there so people can can have that as a touchstone, even if it's not going to change the policy debate in Washington in the short run. I think it's critical just to say, here's where things are. Here's what we know. Here's what we don't know, and not sugarcoat things and not exaggerate. And that's always hard, but that's always my job. And recognize that I can't cure scientific illiteracy. That's if kids come out of elementary school and high school without the basic knowledge, I'm not really going to be able to do very much to bring them up to speed in a 4.5-minute story on NPR. Although I can plug a few gaps here and there, but I can't really solve that problem. I guess let me just end back with a story about Ken Cuccinelli. I started with the Attorney General from Virginia. At least I take some comfort in thinking that the judicial system is still based on facts by and large. So let's hope that as he proceeds with his lawsuit against Mike Mann at the University of Virginia, I think that is at least one forum where facts still do matter. So thankful for that, and thankful for your time.
Okay, we'll take questions now, and as our practice at Dickey Center events, we always like to give students preference. There are students with microphones, and we are recording, so please hold off on asking your question until you have a microphone in your hand. But students, raise your hand, and let's start with questions. Who wants to go first? Looking for students first. Here we go. On the right. Can you raise your hand again? Good.
So in your talk today, you gave a lot of things that you thought could happen over time to change this, different ways you could appeal to the public, but you also went through a lot of things that were standing in the way. Like, where do you personally see, what do you see happening to combat climate change in the future? Do you think it's going to stay, held down by gridlock in the political system, or do you see something actually changing?
Well, I think it is starting to change. I think that the question is whether it's going to change fast enough, and I think that's a huge open question. Fossil fuels are really the metabolism of the global economy, and if you're talking about changing what the economy runs on, that's a huge, huge order, and I think there's I actually don't believe that anything that happens in Washington D.C. or even the international talks, I don't think those really have the leverage to do that, sustain it over the decades and decades it will take. I think it's going to have to be more organic and less sort of directed from the top. And exactly what form that will take, I'm not sure. I will mention I mentioned Roger Pilkey's book, and he's part of the small cadre of thinkers who basically say the only real solution here is to make clean energy cheaper than coal, and it's not clear how you could make that happen because coal has so much energy packed into it, and it's not that hard to get to. It's not that expensive. But they basically say if you could make clean energy cheaper than coal, basically the problem solves itself, because then as the world develops, everyone will go for the cheapest source of energy, which will be clean, and you've solved the problem. But easy to say, hard to do. But I think that to the extent that there is a vision beyond just sort of thinking about, well, Kyoto didn't work, maybe we can come with Kyoto 2 or something like that. Those seem to be maybe equal long shots, but I think that as a concept at any rate is something that deserves a lot deeper thought from us.
Questions? Student questions? Come on, students, don't let us down. There we go.
Hi. You said that the business model of media or reporting isn't working. I was wondering if you've seen or if you can think of a model that does work.
Actually, NPR is one of the few business models that's still strong, and interestingly enough, because what's happening in the world of the news media is obviously advertising is drying up as fewer and fewer people are buying newspapers because they're reading them online, and online ads are much cheaper than print ads. So those companies are losing circulation, they're losing advertising, and that's a sort of a spiral that they're trying to figure out how to get away from. NPR happens to work because people like us enough that they just send us money. We ask them for money and they send it to us. And I think that actually there are some for-profit newspapers and other news organizations that are thinking, how can we adapt that model to work for us? So it's a model that works. I mean, we've certainly felt the effects of the economic downturn in 2008, 2009. We were not immune in any means, but I think fundamentally it's a good model. It works. People, as long as we keep producing stuff that people want to hear, we're in good shape.
I went to like a week-long school in France on communicating climate change, and one of the French journalists there said that what he felt was one of the inherent problems in climate change communication is that it's less of a science about champion expansion and more about, the party's over mentality. We need to live within our means. Do you agree with this? And if so, how can a different approach to reporting help shift this mindset?
Yeah, I think that if that's the message, I don't think that has any political legs. I don't think you could make people change just by saying, it's a crisis. We all have to give up our income and our way of life. I just think that's a dead end. And I think that if you're framing the issue that way, you're in trouble. That's why there's no great way to frame the issue except, the idea of having cheap, clean technology better than coal. I mean, that can work, or just, not asking people to completely upend their lives, but try to think about how, fundamentally, as I said, you've got to help the rest of the world develop. You've got to give the 1.5 billion people who don't have electricity. So, so you have to think in a positive way, but it's hard, but that does require clean energy, and it requires smarter use of energy too, which doesn't necessarily mean that you have to suffer. I mean, you can have a car that gets much better mileage than we have right now, electric cars and things like that. There are things you can do to keep supporting the lifestyles that we have that work. But I think, I understand the feeling like, gosh, it's such a big crisis, we do have to just give up on using energy. And I think people are never going to go for that. You just cannot frame the story that way. It will never get people to act.
But isn't that how we handled the ozone hole and acid rain?
The question is, isn't that the way we handled the ozone hole and acid rain? The answer is no. Ozone hole was invisible to us. I mean, how did anyone's life change when we moved from chlorofluorocarbons to HCFCs in our spray cans? The answer is it didn't change at all. We basically most people were unaware that we'd made these changes, and I think that was certainly the paradigm. People sort of say, oh, if only we could do with climate change what we did with CFCs. It's a much, much harder problem. But I mean, that was the beauty of that, was that by and large that problem solved itself because it was only a half a dozen companies even producing these chemicals, and they were willing to shift their production to less dangerous chemicals, and the effect was extremely limited. Economically, the prices of, did the price of air conditioning go up a little bit? Well, maybe, but who actually noticed in relation to prices just going up in general? So actually, unfortunately, it's hard to think of any instance where Americans said, okay, by golly, we'll take the sacrifice. Since World War II, really, when Americans realized that they needed to sacrifice for the war effort. That's the last time. I mean, even funding our more recent wars, you'd think that, there was a philosophy that, well, we should at least ask for a tax increase to pay for the war that we're waging right now. And that was a dead letter in Washington. We're funding it off of debt instead of actually paying for the war that we're fighting. So I think that's a very old-fashioned idea that's kind of disappeared from the American scene.
Any other students?
Hi. You mentioned during the talk something about the balance between growth and sustainability. So, and to me, that's really interesting because I feel like it ties in two of the greatest issues of, our era, our generation. And you've got on one hand this, mass poverty and countries trying to get out of the crisis they're in and trying to develop. And on the other hand, you're talking about limiting growth and, limiting, emissions and all that jazz. Whereas you've got companies where, China, India are only now entering, they're having citizens entering a middle class threshold. You've got Africa still needing to be brought up into that threshold. What are your thoughts? Can you elaborate a bit more on the balance to strike between those two?
Yeah, well, ideally, you develop, with the cleanest technology you can. And the U.S. and other developed world countries can play a role, and they've pledged some money to do this, to provide money to help countries develop cleaner energy supplies in the process of doing that. Not so much for China. There's been a little bit of cooperation on experiments with carbon capture and sequestration in China, very, very small pilot scale studies to say, well, if China's going to exploit all of its coal, can we help them at least not put all the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere? And so there's been a little bit of exploration about that. But it is very, it isn't reasonable to say that the rest of the world cannot develop to our standard of living. We're here. We can't say, sorry, we didn't realize what a huge mistake it was to the climate to do that. So, but now that we know you can't do it, there are some people who seem to have that attitude, but it's not, it's never going to work. And it doesn't make really a lot of sense to try. So the issue that gets back to, how quickly can we develop cleaner sources of energy? We're going to need a huge amount more energy than we have right now. How do we develop it in a clean way? And that's a tough challenge. But I think that's, if you got to keep your eye on the ball, that's the ball.
Here we go. It's interesting. My grandmother believes absolutely every word that comes out of Fox News, and my grandfather believes absolutely every word that comes out of the New York Times and out of NPR and things like that, which, there's... Talk to each other? Well, it is no end of family drama, I will give you that. Now, neither of my grandparents have any background in science or a variety of other forms of information. Given the fact that journalists and news organizations and newspapers and stuff, they have to make money. I understand that because they're private corporations and things like that. But they often use sensationalism and distortion of fact, if you will, in order to make that money to sell papers or whatever. To what degree should journalists and the media be responsible for information integrity? I understand that it's their own bread and butter that they cut out when they maybe report what we find in labs, because what we find in labs is lots of uncertainty and it's not that interesting. But I can't decide if I should criticize journalists for trying to put food on their table, or if I should understand it as a fact of the way it has to be.
I think there's two things going on. I like to believe that I don't sensationalize, and I think most of my colleagues at NPR don't sensationalize. I think one thing that we do, which is sort of a necessity of human communication, is we make stories out of facts, because they aren't just, you can take 50 random facts and just spray them out there, and it doesn't make a coherent story. If you want to get a storyline so that people can understand and digest the facts in some way, you have to frame a story. And in some people's mind, framing a story is distorting the facts, because you have to decide how they fit together. You have to accept somebody else's frame for how they fit together. So I think that that's not sensationalizing, but it's also processing the information in some way. And I think that's unavoidable. I think it's important. It's our oral tradition came from sitting around the campfire telling stories, right? And that's fundamentally what we're still doing, even though the facts don't always necessarily fit into these tidy little stories. But by necessity, we pick the facts that do tell the stories, or we look at the facts and we see what story they best tell when they're all added together. But it's intellectually an imperfect process, because there's always more things they're leaving out and so on. I think there certainly are examples of even the New York Times sensationalizing stories, but I think that it's more driven by the desire to tell a compelling story than to make stuff up or to twist things and so on. And I think that as an educated news consumer, I hope that people can can understand that. I mean, if you regard something as sensationalized, you obviously have some basis for making that conclusion. And presumably you're getting your facts from the news media somewhere along the lines to reach that conclusion. So not everyone's sensationalizing all the time. And when you're getting it, if you're perceiving it, it's because perhaps you've read it somewhere else and it has not been spun in that manner.
All right, let's just go to general questions now. Yeah, please, this gentleman, raise your hand up.
Actually, this is a follow-up to your dialogue here. And I'm thinking there's a satirical counterpart to the Watergate story, and the satirical counterpart is the story of ClimateGate. There's a story about how these couple of characters in East Anglia basically are playing petty politics with matters that might rise to the level of being of tertiary import with regard to the whole picture of climate change. And the next day, this story is sweeping the country and the Western world. Front page news. How did it get to be front page of the New York Times and the Valley News? You know, there is a story there, and it follows right up on this issue of sensationalizing.
Mm-hmm. And I think that was an example of a story that was picked up first and foremost and most loudly by the blogosphere. I think that ended up on NPR and the New York Times a little bit later than that, and our consideration of that story was based on the fact that this was out there and being spun in a very dramatic way by the blogs, and my feeling was there's some real meat here, and it raises some real issues. Maybe in the old days, before the blogs and before everything existed, there were things I would look at that would I just say they're so kooky that I don't even have to deal with them. I'm not going to report them because they're so far out there. I'm not saying this would have risen to that level, but these days we recognize that once something is out there, we have to dive in, and we have to dive in fast and hard on something like that. And my story was not an apologia to the scientists who wrote some pretty uncomfortable things in there, but it was also not saying this proves that climate change is a global hoax and we can all go back about our business and forget about it. So, yeah, it's another way that sort of the mainstream media and the blogosphere sort of feeds back on each other.
Were you personally surprised by the implosion of the Kerry Lieberman-Graham bill?
No. No, I thought there was political traction on this was very tenuous in Washington, and I thought the legislative agenda seemed precarious to begin with, so I was not surprised when it came to an end.
Yeah, here. No. Oh, okay, and then down here. Yeah, go ahead.
Here, I'll ask the question.
I was hoping you could comment on your perception of change or lack of in science education, because you mentioned it briefly, but just sort of nationally, if you've seen a change or decrease in comprehension, or if it's been the same over the last 20 years.
I haven't seen that data recently enough. I'm sorry. I think that people are always wringing their hands about science education, and there's certainly a new effort to improve it. But I don't, in terms of long-term trends, I'm sorry, I can't help you.
Following up on one of your points, something made a lot more sense to me after I read a quote from somebody in the Bush White House press corps who was criticizing journalists for being reality-based. And his comment was, we make our own reality. And while you're trying to figure out that reality, we go and change it.
Karl Rove, was that?
I don't think it was Karl Rove. It might have been. But first, do you see any hope that our country's politics might someday be reality-based? And if not, what can we do? 19 out of 20 of the current Republican senatorial candidates who are not running for re-election but challengers deny that human action is causing climate change. That's not true in Europe. Merkel says it's a problem. All the conservative governments in Europe say climate change is happening, we've got to do something. But here we have one party who basically uniformly says, nope, it's not happening. How do we get around that?
Vote.
First, thank you very much for your great reporting on NPR. I really enjoyed it. It's wonderful.
Thanks.
So I'm going to maybe think that we can get something positive out of this. I study healthcare utilization and ever increasing healthcare utilization. And so we have the situation where, using less energy and fossil fuels creates dissonance. I mean, it's, the American way. You're telling me how to that I've got to skimp, I've got to use less, et cetera. That doesn't sound like a lot of fun. But yet, if you think about it, and then you have these situations where there's uncertainty, and then you have East Anglia, and so there's some reasons that you can doubt it. So then you look at healthcare and you say, well, 90% of healthcare, in fact, is huge uncertainty, and there's been a lot of situations where, for instance, drug companies are keeping data from being published. So, there's the Celebrex. There's all these instances where doctors are getting paid by drug companies or other things. And so I'm thinking we need to take this paradigm and figure out how to get the same uncertainty to people. So they say, well, we've got to now, I went to 10 doctors and I got 10 different opinions. That means they must all be wrong, or at least I should do nothing about it, which is basically what we're saying. I think with global warming is that we're not really sure. So the answer is do nothing.
Yeah, well, I think medicine. I'm not sure why you think that's a cheerful example, counterexample to the afternoon.
Yes, we can spend less, maybe.
We could spend, we could, but I mean. That's all nice to talk about, but I also think that it's hard to get people to accept that basically you don't need all these tests. I have a personal story. My father had some sort of strange medical condition that he couldn't quite figure out, and they've spent $10,000 or $20,000 or $30,000 on tests trying to suss it out, and they're nowhere. It's like, well, you have achy legs, okay, and it's like, but the instinct is, well, let's just run more tests. Let's do more things. And I was trying to talk to the doctors and saying, what are we going to get out of these tests? And they said, don't ask that question. Go up to the radiologist, have another MRI. So I think that, the model, it's a little different because, there's some hope and expectation that maybe something will materialize and my dad will finally get, something that will help him be a little more comfortable. But I think it's not a model that says, look, we can do more with less. That's not the way medicine's going either. Medicine's doing less with more, maybe, as a matter of fact.
I think the only answer is witchcraft.
Witchcraft.
Let's take about 2 more questions then. So, let's see. All right, right down here.
I'm wondering about you as a communicator. So you have a lot of time and a lot of learning. And communicating this, when you talk about things like denial and realizing that it's there, I'm wondering if you have developed some form of like an aerobic activity that you do to frame yourself as you talk about it. Because as we all communicate about these things, part of what I'm feeling as I sit here and listen to you is, reframing myself to go, to continue communicating. And I'm wondering if there's a way that you, unspoken, it can't appear in what you do, but sort of frames yourself as you approach the story, as you approach something to say. Is there anything that you do or that you develop to help yourself do that?
It's an interesting question. I think one thing, I'm naturally an optimistic person, and I'm facing a situation that has a lot of downsides to it. And I think what I always try to do is not to be Pollyanna-ish, but to sort of say, try to think on an optimistic side. Is there, what is the way forward? What is the way out of this, and so on? And even if the topic is grim, or if it's more bad news, it's not to sugarcoat it, but just to say, is, what do? We all have to move forward. The planet's going to keep going, and we all have to make decisions. And so, we can't just sit here and go, oh, geez, more bad news. So I guess I try to tap into that optimism without letting it, as I say, without becoming Pollyanna-ish about what I'm reporting, but just to say, look, you got to have some hope out there. You got to think about how we can get out of this pickle, even if the pickle seems to get more and more sour.
Last question.
Your presentation was really pretty cool. I'm a supporter of NPR, by the way, through VPR Classical.
Thank you.
Your talk inspired two quotes that I remember that I think are relevant to this. The first is from Professor Vítězslav Vytlačil at NYU, and he gave a lecture in the mid-'70s, who said, "To learn how fleeting truth is, ask the same question to members of opposing ideologies." That was one. And the second one that came to mind was from General Sun Tzu's masterpiece, The Art of War, who said, "In order to defeat a superior army, first you must attack its strategy. And then to defeat its strategy, to destroy its strategy, you must infuse it with doubt."
Yeah, those are very on point. Yeah, and it reminds me of I don't think it was a coincidence that Environmental Defense Fund hired Frank Luntz, the Republican pollster, to sort of give them some advice and counsel, because he really had been driving so much of the policy debate through his messaging and so on through the Bush years and so on, that they thought, well, what can he, if we ask him to turn those sort of Machiavellian, I shouldn't use that word because that's not their word, but I mean those kinds of mischievous approaches to sort of spinning popular opinion, and what would he do with this? And it was an interesting answer, basically, that actually the public will support it. You just got to get the politicians to act. It's not really a question of public support. This was not so many months ago that he came out with this. So this is a glimmer of hope. But you got to, the problem right now is a much more about politics than it is about climate change and so on. And it's just what's happening in Washington more broadly than. And as I say, I think that I hope that the Republicans who are running will change, or whomever, the people who are taking this position about global warming is not caused by human activities. I think that's a malleable position, and I think when the political winds blow differently, that position can blow away.
That's a good way to conclude. Remember, vote.
Thanks very much.